The Brookfield WPCA has been pursuing a plan since 2018 to implement sewers on Candlewood Peninsula. In its quest to do so, it has hired a sewer engineering consultant and is now claiming that septic systems are polluting the lake and the drinking water, and that sewers will improve both. We're a group of homeowners who live on or near Candlewood Lake. The lake is an important part of our neighborhoods. In fact, it's the main reason why we came here in the first place and why we continue to live here. Whether we're kayaking in it, fishing in it, swimming in it, or just simply enjoying a beautiful sunset over it, the lake is a key part of our lives. And so the health of the lake is not just an esoteric or theoretical topic for discussion. To us, it's a very real and personal concern. So we decided to undertake an independent fact-finding mission. We read every report and document on the WPCA's website. We worked with experts, including an environmental engineer, and we conducted extensive research, including talking to town officials at the other 4 towns on the lake. We also reviewed case studies of 2 lakes that recently built sewers based on similar recommendations and claims. What we found was that, contrary to the WPCA's claims, the lake is actually relatively healthy. There was no evidence that septics are causing pollution of the lake. The evidence actually shows that replacing septics with sewers would have virtually zero impact on the lake. As to the drinking water, in Candlewood Shores and Arrowhead, the only 2 areas that were tested, we did find some issues. However, we found no evidence that sewers would have any significant impact on those issues, but we did find there are several alternative solutions that are cheaper and more effective than sewers, but which the WPCA failed to discuss. The presentation consists of 3 main parts. The first part will talk about lake water quality and will analyze the WPCA's consultant's findings. The second part also deals with lake water quality, but from the perspective of the experience of other lakes that built sewers. Third part will deal with the drinking water quality, again analyzing the WPCA's consultant's findings. Closing, we'll summarize our findings and also list some potential actions and solutions. The chronology of how we got to where we are today starts in 2014, when the 5 towns that border the lake, Brookfield, Sherman, New Fairfield, New Milford, and Danbury, got together to commission a study of the lake water quality and the milfoil. The conclusion of that study was that the primary source of phosphorus was internal lake sediment, which releases phosphorus due to the normal warming of the lake. And as we'll see later on in the presentation, phosphorus is the key nutrient that in excess can cause harm to the lake. The recommendation of that study was that the lake sediment should be focused on, as well as all other watershed sources of phosphorus. January of 2018, the health department sent a letter to the WPCA requesting that sewers be implemented because they believed that septic systems were polluting the lake. In December of that year, after the WPCA had hired a consultant, the consultant issued a scope plan. The purpose of that plan, according to the consultant, was to address the WPCA's interest in providing sewers to address inadequate septic systems that are understood to be contributing to the lake water quality problems. Interestingly, before the consultant had conducted any studies or done any tests, he had already assumed and understood that septic systems were the cause of the problem. There was no mention in that scope plan at all or concern about drinking water quality, and there was no mention or discussion of the 2014 study's recommendations. From 2019 to 2022, the consultant gathered a lot of information and conducted several tests of the groundwater and soil and submitted them and provided them in several reports that are on the WPCA website. Wherever we've taken information, we try to cite to those reports and the pages so that anyone who's interested can go to the WPCA website and get more information on that. And actually, one other point as to the testing, the consultant conducted tests on 3 out of approximately 1,500 properties, a sample size that, according to our experts, is a statistically insignificant and insufficient sample size upon which to base any recommendation. So that's something to bear in mind. But for now, one of the findings that the consultant came across was that the phosphorus is a key nutrient that impacts Candlewood Lake water quality. In the test 2 report, the the consultant got a limnologist expert opinion that concluded that wastewater is a minor source of phosphorus and its removal would be a benefit to the lake. That expert also said that a plan for reducing the sediment phosphorus release is needed and is recommended. The questions that were left unanswered by the consultant's reports, however, was if wastewater is indeed a minor source of phosphorus, then what are the other more significant sources? And, well, just how much of a benefit will it be to the lake if we remove such a minor source by replacing septics with sewers? None of the consultants' tests were able to determine the relative contributions of phosphorus from all the sources. For example, the contribution of the lake sediment, lawn fertilizer, stormwater runoff, and septics. In addition, the consultant never addressed a plan for reducing sediment phosphorus, which was recommended by the 2014 five-town study, as well as even by his own expert. So how much phosphorus is discharged into the lake by other sources? According to experts, the EPA, as well as other lakes that have had to deal with water issues, this is the number one key question. It's a starting point before deciding on any action. We know already that lake sediment is the number one source of phosphorus, but what about the other watershed sources? Without knowing how much phosphorus enters the lake from the following: stormwater runoff, lawn fertilizer, animal waste, septic systems, boaters, etc., it's very difficult to determine what action should be taken. For example, if septic systems contributed a large amount of phosphorus and they were replaced with sewers, that should logically result in a major positive impact on lake water quality. On the other hand, if septics contributed a small amount of phosphorus, then replacing septics with sewers would have virtually no impact on the lake. So knowing how much phosphorus is discharged by each source is important. So at the September 14, 2022 WPCA public meeting, we asked that question to the WPCA's consultant. The answer he gave us was, essentially, it's a fair question, but he was not hired to do that. He was hired only to look at the impact of septic systems, something that he calculated and which we will analyze in detail in just a few minutes. We then asked the WPCA the same question, and the WPCA's answer, which is on their website, was, this is beyond the scope of the WPCA. The WPCA is correct. This is beyond their scope. Their business is operating sewers. They have no expertise or experience in lake water quality issues. However, the health of the lake is precisely what we are concerned about, so we decided to explore this question further. As we have seen, the primary source of phosphorus is internal. It's the lake sediment. As the bottom of the lake warms over the summer, oxygen is reduced and phosphorus is released, raising the level of phosphorus in the lake. Again, this is not a man-made process. It's not due to any discharge. It's a normal seasonal process that occurs every September and October. It has nothing to do with septics, so putting in sewers would do nothing to reduce this. How did the phosphorus get in the sediment? Well, for one thing, soil naturally contains a certain amount of phosphorus. And before the lake was created in 1929, the soil in the valley was used for over 200 years as farmland, which itself is very rich in phosphorus. In addition, when the lake was flooded, large trees and brush that were left at the bottom of the lake to decay added, through the decaying process, large amounts of phosphorus to the sediment. Although this is a natural process, as a 2014 five-town report and other experts recommend, there are things that can and should be done proactively to ensure the future of the lake to address the phosphorus in the sediment. And we will discuss some of these when we look at other lakes' experiences. As to external sources, the number one main source is stormwater runoff. As we'll discuss in more detail in the next couple of slides, multiple agencies and experts deem this to be the number one most significant watershed source of phosphorus and nitrogen. And in fact, other lakes, Peach Lake and Lake Apocon, who we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, their experiences showed this to be the case. As far as the consultant, in their reports, the consultant simply dismissed this, saying that the stormwater drains are on private roads and they're the responsibility of private associations and districts. Number three, boaters and island inhabitants. The impact of raw sewage that's discharged directly into the lake is very significant. According to one study, a single boat illegally dumping its waste tank into a lake can have more of an impact on the lake than a dozen or more failing septics. In addition, inhabitants that live all summer long on Pine Island or that spend all day on other islands are also discharging untreated waste directly into the lake. This past summer, for example, New Fairfield had to close Blueberry Island because human waste from boaters had made the water around the island unfit and dangerous. Number 4, animal waste. Animal waste can be a significant contributor of phosphorus to a lake. One goose can deposit up to a ½ pound of phosphorus per year. That's the equivalent output of the septic systems on 25 homes. Number 5, failing septic systems. These too can be contributors of phosphorus and nitrogen to a lake, especially after heavy rains. Maintenance of septic systems is a very important factor in maintaining lake water quality. Of all the above sources, WPCA's consultant focused on only number 5, septics, whereas EPA best practice is that the amount contributed by all sources should be considered before deciding on what action to take. Of the external sources of phosphorus, the most significant is stormwater runoff. According to the Brookfield Stormwater Plan, as well as many experts in water treatment, it is the most significant source of water quality problems. As illustrated by the chart on the right, which is taken from the consultant's report, when it rains, a sheet of water flows down and across lawns, carrying fertilizer from the lawns directly into the lake. How significant is this? Well, consider that one typical 55-pound bag of fertilizer contains 5.5 pounds of phosphorus. That's the equivalent amount discharged by approximately 250 septic systems in 1 year. So it's no surprise that, as stated in the consultant's report, runoff has a very high concentration of 26 micrograms of phosphorus per liter. There is also other runoff from storm drains that is equally or more damaging. Anyone who lives near the lake is aware of all the stormwater drains that line our streets. And when it rains, it's like a mini river that flows down the hills and into those drains, carrying not only fertilizer, but leaves and all sorts of chemicals, animal waste, and in the winter, salt and ice melting chemicals. All of that goes down the drains and then directly funneled into the lake, untreated. If there were more land to absorb that runoff, the soil might be able to naturally treat and reduce the harmful effects. But the more development, the more streets and driveways, etc., experts call it impervious cover, the less land there is to absorb and the worse the impact of runoff. The impact of stormwater runoff is so damaging that Connecticut Deep considers the Housatonic River to be impaired from it. So given the significant impact of runoff on bodies of water, we found it puzzling why the consultant dismissed and failed to discuss the effects of runoff simply because the stormwater drains were, as he said, on private roads that were the responsibility of the homeowner associations, especially since the property that he performed tests on were also private, yet that did not stop him from performing those tests. Next, we'll look at septic systems. As most of you know, these systems utilize an underground tank to break down the waste and to allow the wastewater to flow into leaching fields. There, the soil, bacteria, and the insects are utilized in a natural process to further break down the liquid into environmentally necessary nutrients. The water is then used to replenish the groundwater. It's a process that replicates the way nature has recycled human waste since the beginning of time. And properly operating septics are supposed to return a certain percentage of water or recharge into the ground, as well as phosphorus and nitrogen to the soil and groundwater. These are nutrients that are needed in nature to replenish the environment. According to the EPA, if septic systems are properly installed, sited, and maintained, they can protect public health, preserve valuable water resources, and maintain economic vitality. The EPA further says that septic systems are cost-effective and provide economic benefits by reducing the large infrastructures and energy costs to collect and treat wastewater. Because there are no ongoing sewer bills and there is no discharge of treated water into the rivers and lakes, septics are often the preferred environmental and cost-effective option for treating waste. Failing septic systems, on the other hand, can negatively affect groundwater and adjacent wetlands. Basically, a failing septic system doesn't allow the process to break down the waste in the way that nature can handle it. There are a number of new technologies that are available for new and existing septic systems that can further reduce the level of phosphorus and nitrogen. Let's review what we found so far. 1. Phosphorus is a key nutrient that, although it's needed for a healthy lake, it can in high concentration levels cause harm to the lake. 2. The main source of phosphorus in the lake is internal. It's the lake sediment which releases phosphorus as part of a natural seasonal process. 3. There are other external sources of phosphorus, the main one being stormwater runoff, but also boaters, island inhabitants, geese, leaves and brush, and septic systems. Although the WPCA does not know how much phosphorus is released by these sources, they claim that septics are responsible for discharging damaging amounts to the lake. We decided to look more closely at the evidence the WPCA was using to support their claim. They basically used two pieces of evidence. One, they used a couple of photos taken 10 and 11 years ago, and two, they used a calculation by a consultant of how much phosphorus is discharged by the septic systems based on his borings. These photos were offered by the WPCA as evidence that the septic systems were damaging the lake. The photo on the right shows a big increase in phosphorus after a prolonged period of no rain. The WPCA claims that since there was no other water input to the lake during that period, septics must have been the cause of the increase, which is indicated by the color green as opposed to blue on the left. The WPCA did not discuss that the picture on the left was taken in June of 2012 and the one on the right in August of 2013, both over 10 years ago. But not only that, they were a year apart and at different seasons. The one on the left at the beginning of summer and the one on the right at the end of summer. As we know, as confirmed by the 2014 five-town study, the phosphorus level is expected to increase in August, in other words, in the picture on the right, as the lake gets warmer. WPCA also did not take into account two other factors. One, as you can see by the circle on both pictures, there's a tiny body of water, a reservoir, in both pictures. That reservoir has no homes and no septic systems around it. Yet, as you can see, on the left it's in blue and in the right it's in green, showing the same level of increase, something which is not really explainable if it was due to septic systems. Another thing that wasn't taken into account by the WPCA is the Housatonic River, which is here indicated right over here by this bright red line, which indicates a very high level of phosphorus. And as we know, the Housatonic River feeds the lake. Next, we looked at the amount of increase in the concentration level. On the left, there's a concentration level of 1, and on the right, it increased to 21. Now, according to consultants' calculation of how much phosphorus is discharged into the lake by septic systems, which is contained in Table 5.1 of Task Report 2, which we'll talk about in just a minute, septic systems from all the 5 towns discharge a total of 1.36 kilograms per day of phosphorus into the lake. That equates to a 0.007 increase in phosphorus level per day. At that rate, if the WPCA was correct that septics were the cause of the increase, it would have taken a total of 2,957 days for the phosphorus level in the lake to go from 1 to 21. Our conclusion: the photos provide no evidence to support the WPCA's claims, apart from the fact that they were taken 10 years ago, 14 months apart, not after a period of no rain. It's scientifically impossible for septics alone to be the cause of increase in the phosphorus level. The reality is such increase is due to a variety of reasons, the primary one being the lake sediment, as the phosphorus level is expected to increase in August due to a normal seasonal process. The other piece of evidence used by the WPCA is consultants' calculation of how much phosphorus is released by septics. This is contained in Table 5.1, and it's a key calculation. It's the most important figure in all of the reports. Why do we say that? Well, because if this figure is correct, then this is the amount of phosphorus that would stop being discharged into the lake if sewers were built. If the figure is significant, then presumably there would be a significant impact on the lake. Conversely, if the amount is immaterial, then its removal would have basically no impact on the lake. This is table 5.1. Let me take a second to just briefly explain a few things. In this column, you'll see is the column that's taken directly from the consultant's report and task report 2, his calculation of the amount of phosphorus discharged. These two columns represent our calculations, which are based on a couple of different adjustments, which I'll explain in just a second. Essentially, what's going on in this table is that consultant calculated the amount of phosphorus that each home discharges per year. In this case, for example, 0.213 pounds per year. He then takes that amount and multiplies it by the amount of homes, 1346 in all of the peninsula, comes out to a total amount, and then divides it by about 15 billion gallons, which is the annual turnover of the lake, which gives him a figure of 2.2. 2.2, according to the consultant, is roughly 8% of the amount of phosphorus that a healthy lake should absorb. One can debate whether 8%, the removal of 8% is significant or not, but in any event, it's an amount that should be considered. However, when we look more closely at this table, and our experts reviewed it, they noticed three things that were unusual, questionable, if not incorrect. And I'd like to go over those with you now and show you what the alternative calculations would be. First thing we noticed was that the consultant used a figure of 7 when he calculated the amount of phosphorus discharged by septic tanks. This amount was taken from a 10-year average in Massachusetts. He did not use the actual sampling results that he got from his testing. We used those actual amounts, 2.56 and 6.3. Those were the actual amounts that he found that were in his reports from his borings. Next, we noticed that with respect to how much reduction of the phosphorus occurs as a result of the soil absorption, he used a figure of 90%. We don't know why he used that figure. There's no explanation in the reports. However, when we looked at the test results, we noticed that the actual absorption rate was 99% in both cases, in both borings. So we used the actual test results. Our experts' feeling was that the purpose of doing the test results was to use those figures. If we're going to use these abstract figures, there was no need for any testing. These figures could have been calculated by anyone sitting in an office. When you use the actual results of testing, you'll see that instead of 2.20, the results you get is 0.08 and 0.21. Those figures are 91 to 96% less than the 2.2 figure that he calculated. Third thing we noticed is that in calculating the concentration level, the consultant used the turnover volume of the lake, about 15 billion gallons. Our experts and a lot of the research we've done, concentration levels are based on or calculated using total volume, not turnover. There's no explanation why this figure was used, but we decided to do the calculation using what we believe to be the correct way to calculate concentration levels, which would be the actual total volume of the lake, which is about 51 billion gallons. That's also taken from his report. By the way, every piece of data and information on this table is taken directly from the consultant's reports. We did not do any testing or change any other figures. If we use that figure and we do the calculation, we get a dramatically different number. Instead of 2.20, we get 0.024 and 0.063, which is 97 to 99.8% less than a 2.2 figure. To summarize our table 5.1 analysis, when we use consultant sampling data, septic systems contribute 0.024 to 0.063 of phosphorus to the lake, not 2.20. These amounts are less than 1%. Actually, it's 0.01% to 0.2% of the amount of phosphorus that the lake could absorb, based on a mesotropic lake range of 20 to 30. Stated another way, There are sources other than septics that are responsible for 99.8 to 99.9% of the phosphorus that the lake could absorb. Our conclusion: replacing septics with sewers based on this data would have virtually no impact on the lake phosphorus level. In addition to reviewing the consultants' reports, we also looked at other independent agencies to see how they assessed Candlewood Lake, to see if their assessment was consistent or inconsistent with the WPCA's claims that septics were polluting or harming the lake. Connecticut Deep rated Candlewood Lake for 2022, and it's been the same rating for the past number of years, as fully supporting, which is its highest rating, for both aquatic life and recreational use. The Candlewood Lake Authority's assessment is that there are many factors that affect the health of the lake. Neil Stalter, who is the Director of Ecology at the CLA, spoke at the 9/14/22 meeting. In that meeting, he said that the lake is complex. It's affected by runoff, loss of vegetation, lawn fertilizer, and the main issue is the internal release of phosphorus from erosion, or the sediment, as we've seen. He said that the WPCA is pursuing one course of action, that is sewers, that may benefit the lake, but the magnitude of which we can't say with any certainty. In 2018, Mr. Stalter said the lake had its third best water clarity measured by SekiDisc since we started keeping track in 1985, is the best in 20 years. In 2020, Mr. Stalter said that in his professional opinion, Candlewood Lake is a very healthy lake. There are 4 towns and 1 city bordering Candlewood Lake. We asked the WPCA, since Brookfield constitutes only about 8 to 9% of the lakefront, why is the WPCA going ahead alone with sewers? Their answer was, quote, someone has to take the lead. We contacted some officials in other towns on the lake. Not a single official expressed any concern about the septic system being a source of pollution, nor did any of them have any plans to even consider sewers. It's one thing for someone to take the lead. It's quite another for someone to act contrary to everyone else's views. The EPA and all lake experts all say that any plans to address a lake's water quality must be undertaken in coordination with all communities on the lake for there to be any chance of success. Given this, we find the WPCA's response to be quite puzzling, if not irresponsible. We do not understand why the WPCA, rather than trying to coordinate with the other towns, has chosen to ignore them just because they don't agree with the WPCA. And we also do not understand the WPCA's logic in thinking that sewering only 8 to 9% of the lakefront at a cost in the tens of millions of dollars will have any meaningful impact on the lake. Now we'll go on to part 2 of lake water quality, where we'll talk about the actual experiences of 2 other lakes that built sewers in reliance on similar advice. The WPCA wants to replace septics with sewers because they say in the future that will improve the lake's water quality. Although every lake is different, before spending tens of millions of dollars on a multi-year sewer project, it's logical and prudent to look at the experience and actual results of other lakes that followed similar recommendations to replace septics with sewers. Much of the discussion thus far has hinged on data and rather technical explanations. However, the most compelling evidence of all is actual results. We can debate predictions of future outcomes, but results do not lie. So we decided to look at actual case studies of 2 lakes that were in the same position and went ahead and built sewers. The first lake we looked at was Peach Lake, which is located nearby North Salem in southeast New York. That lake had high levels of phosphorus and nitrogen. In 2008, there was a separate independent study that concluded that stormwater runoff was the primary source of phosphorus. In 2012, a sewer engineering firm that had been hired to conduct a study concluded that septics were the cause of the problem, and they said that sewers were the only way to stem the decline of water quality. At the cost of about $31 million, they built sewers, and the sewer engineering firm at the time predicted that in 10 years there will be a significant change. 2013, the sewers enabled increased development, which also increased the stormwater runoff problem. 2017, the phosphorus levels continued to be high and required action. The town installed what's called the jellyfish filter, which actually filtered the phosphorus out of the sediment of the lake. 2019, to further reduce the phosphorus levels, alum, which is a chemical treatment that binds and reduces phosphorus, was added to the lake. The conclusion that we draw from this was that replacing the septics with sewers did not effectively reduce the phosphorus levels. In fact, the phosphorus levels continued to be high and they required alternative actions. It turns out that, as the 2008 independent study had concluded, stormwater runoff was likely the more significant issue. The second lake we looked at was Lake Hopatcong, which is located in New Jersey. One of the reasons we looked at this lake was that it has been cited by the WPCA as an example of what could happen to Candlewood Lake if septics are not replaced. That lake had high levels of phosphorus and nitrogen and had a toxic algae bloom problem. They hired a sewer engineering firm to conduct a study. In 2008, that study concluded that septics were causing the problem and they recommended sewers. Again, sewers were built, in this case costing greater than $59 million, plus about $11 million for sewage plant upgrades. 2019, about 10 years later, the lake had the highest level of phosphorus in 17 years. The highly toxic algae bloom, which was caused by the high phosphorus and nitrogen, forced the lake to be closed. The Sierra Club said at that time that this is a clear sign of failed policies to protect clean water by controlling overdevelopment and stormwater runoff. In 2022, again, parts of the lake had to be closed due to toxic algae. This time, the reports were that it was caused by several days of high temperatures and heavy rain that likely washed nutrients like lawn fertilizer and animal waste into the lake. The municipalities, it was quoted, had to adopt phosphorus controlling technologies and stormwater infrastructure upgrades to remove the chemicals that fuel the algae growth. Our conclusion from reviewing this lake was that, again, replacing septics with sewers did not effectively reduce the phosphorus level. The failure to address the stormwater runoff, which was exacerbated by increased development, was cited as likely cause of the high phosphorus and nitrogen. Lessons learned from these two case studies. In each case, the sewer engineering firm involved in building sewers also conducted the studies that concluded septics were the cause of the phosphorus and nitrogen problems. Other sources, such as internal erosion and stormwater runoff, were minimized. In each case, they recommended sewers as a solution. And in each case, millions of dollars and years later, it became evident that sewers were not the solution. In fact, by not addressing the other problems, their problems got worse. Removing septics may have reduced some phosphorus, but it turned out that the other sources of phosphorus were the bigger problem, and there were other simpler, cheaper solutions, such as the jellyfish filters and alum. Lastly, we noted that the WPCA and the sewer engineering construction firms who sold product and expertise as sewers are able to offer one and only one solution, sewers. This is not necessarily criticizing these firms or ascribing any bad intent on their part, but it's simply that it's similar like as if you're shopping for a small car and you walk into a dealer that has only pickup trucks, naturally he's going to try to sell you a truck. In reality, as we've noted here, there are other alternative, perhaps cheaper and more effective solutions to the problems than sewers, but they were not really focused on or offered as a solution. The third part of our presentation relates to drinking water quality. There are two main findings with respect to the water quality. One was the nitrate level. The second one was the existence of PFOA, PFOS chemicals. The WPCA consultant set forth his findings with respect to nitrate levels in Task Report 2. Essentially, he confirmed Candlewood Shores and Arrowhead water tests, finding that nitrates were basically 7 milligrams per liter in Candlewood Shores and 6.85 in Arrowhead. Both amounts were below the limit of 10, but were deemed unhealthy by the consultant. Our research could not determine whether such levels are actually unhealthy, but many experts do consider levels over 6 to 8 to be of concern, and so we agree these levels are an issue. What are the possible causes of elevated nitrates level? According to the WPCA's consultant, nitrates in groundwater come from lawn fertilizer and septics. This illustration taken from the consultant's report shows the groundwater receiving nitrogen and phosphorus both from lawn fertilizer as well as septic systems. Connecticut Deep and CLA consider lawn fertilizer and stormwater runoff as very significant sources of nitrate. And stormwater runoff is the most significant source of water quality problems according to Brookfield's stormwater plan. So we know that nitrates in our groundwater comes from lawn fertilizer and stormwater runoff, and as well as from septics, which is supposed to return a certain amount of nitrogen to the groundwater. What we don't know, and what is a key question, is how much nitrate comes from all those three sources. Consultant performed no upgrading testing, and no other tests or evidence were provided to show the relative amounts of each source. Instead, the WPCA assumed, without citing any evidence, that all of the nitrate found in the drinking water came from septics. The WPCA's consultant found the presence of PFOA and PFOSs, which are called forever chemicals, or we'll call them PF chemicals here, in the drinking water of Candlewood shores at a level of 45 parts per trillion and in Arrowhead at 16.19 parts per trillion. WPCA then goes on to claim that septics are the source of such chemicals and that sewers will remediate the problem. So what evidence did the WPCA rely on to make such claims? None. There was no evidence found or cited. In fact, there was evidence to the contrary. Consultants' tests did not find PF chemicals in the soil or in the septic discharge, even though he found it in the drinking water. So how might PF chemicals have gotten into the water? Well, let's look at what they are. PF chemicals are industrial chemicals, not human byproduct. They're called forever chemicals because they do not break down in nature. Companies have been dumping in waterways for over 70 years, and today they're found in almost every water body in the world and in the blood of almost every person in the US. They're used in hundreds of products, for example, Teflon, waterproofing products, Scotchguard, and firefighting foam. The Housatonic River that feeds the lake has PF chemicals, likely emanating from industrial sites upriver. Fish, for example, in the river near Derby were found to have high levels of PF chemicals. These chemicals are hazardous to our health, and in June 2022, the EPA issued health advisory setting a limit of 70 parts per trillion. And just this March, the EPA issued proposed regulations which would set a much lower limit of 4 parts per trillion, and for the first time would require all water companies to test and remediate. So how might PF chemicals have gotten into our drinking water? Well, according to an expert who was hired by consultant to do a peer review of his study, the pumping of the wells causes the groundwater level to drop. That in turn creates a hydraulic effect which causes the water to flow from the lake to the well. This is illustrated by this depiction on the right, which is taken from the consultant's report. And if you'll notice, the solid blue arrows indicate the flow of water from the lake to the groundwater. The dotted line is the water level, which you see as its water is pumped up, drops, creating the suction effect with drawing the water down. Given that, we know that the Housatonic has PF chemicals, and we know that it feeds the lake. We also know, based on this peer review study, that the lake water flows from the lake to the well groundwater, and we know that the wells pump up the groundwater. This suggests to us that the lake, and quite possibly the fire department that's near the wells, are more logical sources of the PF chemicals in drinking water than the septics. Although it is theoretically possible that septics, or sewers for that matter, could discharge PF chemicals into the environment if products with PF chemicals are flushed down the drain, there is an abundance of research and literature on PF chemicals, and none of it, and no one, not the EPA or any expert, mentioned septics as a meaningful source. And nothing and no one even suggests or mentions sewers as a solution. We should make an effort to find out if there is an obvious source, but it is difficult and ultimately it may be impossible to determine how PF chemicals got into our drinking water. Rather than spending time and money trying to figure out how PF chemicals got in the water, it is more important to take action to remediate. And there are only two feasible solutions: filtering the water or getting an alternate water supply. In his report, the WPCA's consultant actually listed three options. One was sewers, two was filtering the water to remove the nitrates and PF chemicals, and three was to get an alternate water supply. Although option one, sewers, may reduce nitrates, it is disingenuous for sewers to be listed as an option for PF chemicals, as only options 2 and 3 are effective. The WPCA, however, chose to ignore these two options, focusing only on sewers. There are, however, filters available now that can reduce nitrates and PF chemicals, and an alternate water supply is also available. For the WPCA, which says it is concerned with residents' health, to ignore these options, which would cleanse our drinking water faster, cheaper, and more effectively than sewers, just because these options are not consistent with their narrative to promote sewers, is at best morally wrong and at worst an actual derogation of their duties to residents. That concludes our presentation. Now we'll summarize our findings. 1. There is no evidence, neither the photos offered by the WPCA nor their consultant's calculation, nor anything else in the reports that supports the WPCA's claims that septics are causing pollution to the lake. To the contrary, the results of borings actually showed that replacing septics with sewers would have virtually no impact on lake phosphorus levels. 2. The experience of other lakes that built sewers because they too were told septics were the cause of high phosphorus showed that it was not the septics, but rather other factors, such as sediment and stormwater runoff, that were the main cause of high phosphorus levels. 3. All independent assessments state that the lake is satisfactory and relatively healthy, and no other town agrees with the WPCA's claims, and no one else is considering sewers. 4. Drinking water levels of nitrate and PF chemicals are within health guidelines, but they're at elevated levels that are a concern and should be addressed promptly. There is, however, no evidence of the relative impact that septics have on the nitrate level, and no evidence that septics are a source of PF chemicals. In sum, spending tens of millions of dollars to build sewers seems illogical, as sewers will have no noticeable impact on the lake or on the nitrate level in drinking water, and no impact at all on the PF chemical level in drinking water. However, that does not mean we should do nothing. As to the lake water, we should be addressing the real issues, the lake sediment and stormwater runoff, in order to reduce phosphorus levels. And there are less costly and more effective solutions, for example, jellyfish filters, alum, retrofitting storm drains, etc. As to drinking water, we should be investigating whether to filter our water or obtain another water source, either of which would be less costly and more effective than sewers. These are the things we should be focusing and spending our time and money on, not sewers. Lastly, we'll talk about potential actions and solutions. Due to the health concerns, at the top of our list of suggested actions is investigation of remedial actions for the PF chemicals. Next, investigate jellyfish filters and alum to address the lake sediment phosphorus. As to septic systems, all failing systems should be addressed. We should require all systems older than 30 years to have a pressure dye test, starting with the marinas and the restaurants on the lake. There should be financial assistance for homeowners, for example, by issuing municipal bonds and using the proceeds to lend to homeowners to replace or repair their septics. Lawn fertilizer should be restricted by lakefront properties. There should be a program to reduce and control the geese population. There should be an education campaign for all residents so they understand the impact of their actions on the lake. Marinas should require all boats that are docked there to have their heads pumped out regularly. The storm drain should be improved or replaced to stop the flow directly into the lake. And the human waste conditions on all of the islands, including Pine Island, should be investigated, and some systems should be come up to control that. These steps may not be easy, but they're far easier, cheaper, and ultimately more environmentally friendly and more effective than sewers in addressing our concerns. That's the end of our presentation. We thank you for listening. We hope you found it informative, and we also hope that you stay involved and contact your local town officials if you have any thoughts or concerns about what we've covered here.